So we're grateful for your presence tonight. Fordham's partnership with the New York Public Library that makes presentations like this possible, and of course, Dr. Stavans' willingness to share some of his research with us. On that note, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you all. Ilan Stavans is a Lewis-Sebring Professor of Humanities and Latin America and Latino Culture at Amherst College, the publisher of Restless Books, an independent nonprofit publisher devoted to championing essential voices from around the world whose stories speak to us across linguistic and cultural borders, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. His work, translated into 24 languages, has been adapted into film, radio, and theater. His latest book is Conversations on Dictionaries, The Universe in a Book from Cambridge University Press. This academic year, Dr. Stavans is a New York Public Library-Fordham University Fellow on Jewish Studies as he completes a book on Hispanic Antisemitism. Dr. Stavans is already the author of The Seventh Heaven, Travels Through Jewish Latin America from the University of Pittsburgh Press, on the varieties of Hispanic antisemitism. With us tonight, he will discuss why antisemitism cannot be studied in the abstract, for its varieties are always tied to specific historical circumstances. Dr. Stavans will also contemplate Hispanic antisemitism's vicissitudes and principal ideologues from 1492 to the present, as it has mutated from a religious-based hatred to an economic rivalry, and now a political ideology with catastrophic consequences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stavans to the podium for tonight's lecture.
Thank you to Fordham University and the Center for Jewish Studies, and to Magda and Emmanuel for their support, and to Alex, and to Siobhan, and to just about everybody. To Mila, who has been just a pleasure to work with at the New York Public Library. It's a dream fellowship, I can tell you from this end, to have such a reservoir of books and documents of all kinds reach you within 2 hours in your office from all parts of the world where they originated to all branches and all sections of disciplines and knowledge. I feel very grateful to all of you. My purpose tonight, as has been said, is to explore the topic of Hispanic antisemitism, and to do so in a series of notes that I hope will give you a broad sense of where this research is going, what are the major themes, what are the dogmas and credos and challenges, and in doing so, hoping that it will inspire you to explore further into each of these areas. Before I do so, I want to establish two clarifications about the title. First, the word Hispanic. I am using the word Hispanic to refer to the population that connects with Spain and lives in Latin America but is Spanish speaking, meaning that I am deliberately, for the purpose of this discussion, leaving Brazil, the French speaking and the Portuguese speaking Guyanas and other such regions as the Francophone Caribbean out, and exclusively looking at the Hispanic world, with Spain being the fountainhead of what would come afterwards. And second, and by saying so, I want to also specify that when I jump to use the term Latino, I will be referring to Hispanics that live in the United States. And they themselves, we ourselves, might have all kinds of other names to call ourselves: Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, Spanish-speaking people, Latin people. The appellatives are long and varied and very complicated for purposes of discussion, and not to lose concentration or of where I want to go. Latino will serve the purpose that I have. And finally, I want to start with the concept of anti-Semitism. As Alex was mentioning, the concept of anti-Semitism, though very broad and easy to identify, that is, if we went to a dictionary definition, the hatred against Jews, though anti-Semitism could also be understood as hatred or reservation or antagonism against those that are Semitic in background, and that can include many more than the Jews. I am limiting this connotation to Jews in particular, and explaining also that as broad and comprehensive a topic and as intense and current as it is right now, it is also one that often gives itself to misunderstanding. There are indeed many types of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism is focused and emerges from regions that define that anti-Semitism because of the idiosyncratic or metabolistic elements of that culture, meaning that Arabic anti-Semitism is different from French anti-Semitism, from British anti-Semitism, from American anti-Semitism, so on and so forth. And thus, Hispanic anti-Semitism has its own qualities and the defining characteristics as well. I'm going to try to offer a broad view of what those characteristics are. In the end, I don't believe that the differences between anti-Semitism in one region or the other disqualify the idea that we can put them all in a single umbrella and refer to them as one unifying hatred or one unifying antagonism. But it's crucial not to obviate or ignore the fact that it is always homegrown. Anti-Semitism always depends not on the universal, but in the local. Who is it that is reacting to the Jews, and which kind of Jews are being seen in a particular context? And I'm hoping to be able to make the case that that happens especially in Latin America and in Spain. A few more other important elements to keep in mind. There are approximately 650 million Hispanic people in the world. Spain in 20 countries in Latin America. All in all, Spain has close to 50 million people. The 20 countries in Latin America go from Mexico to Argentina to Peru to Cuba in terms of size, demographic density. And within that big context, each of these countries also offers a different lesson of how anti-Semites, how Jews have adapted, where they have come from, what is the homegrown reaction to those Jews, and how those Jews or those anti-Semites have made an impact in the national or local history of that region. Likewise, it's important to keep in mind that one of the huge migrations that has taken place in the last 500 years, but I'm going to reduce it to 150 years here, is from Latin America across the border to the north, and that is the Latino population in the United States. There are, again, roughly speaking, and unfortunately depends on the day, between 65 and 70 million Latinos in the United States. There are more Latinos in the United States than Spaniards in Spain, or Canadians in Canada, or Salvadorians in El Salvador, or Central Americans in Central America. The number of Latinos is immense, is the largest, fastest growing minority in this country, the youngest as well, and clearly now, under the second Trump season, the one that is most in the eye of the storm. The war against immigrants cannot be obviated by the fact that many of these immigrants, not exclusively, are coming from Latin America or have come from Latin America. And as a result, there is this anxiety about the changing nature of what the United States is about, how it perceives itself, and how it perceives those that are coming from the outside. In contrast, there are approximately only about 500,000 Jews in Latin America. It's a very, very small number. The majority of the Jews in Latin America live in Argentina, mainly in Buenos Aires and La Plata, but in other cities as well. Argentina became a magnet of Jewish immigration at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, competing for a while even with Palestine as the place where potentially the Jewish state could be created. In the vision of Zionism, the idea of three locations was debated. Of course, the Promised Land, the biblical homeland, Uganda, and Argentina. And Argentina, for that reason, was also the place where many philanthropic institutions in France, in England, and elsewhere at the end of the 19th century and 20th century invested to bring many of the Yiddish-speaking shtetl dwellers of the Pale of Settlement to immigrate to the Argentine and Brazilian pampas, where they could recreate a kind of shtetl life that would allow for a different chapter in Jewish history. And much more than any other part of Latin America, the numbers of immigrants that came at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were Yiddish speakers, Ashkenazi Jews, that were relocating them, often without them necessarily knowing where they were being shipped. It was the Baron Maurice de Hirsch, it was the Alliance Israélite Universelle, foundations and philanthropic individuals that had spotted this part of the world as a potential place where Jews could live in peace, Jews could live in harmony, and Jews could have a new life beyond the poverty that existed in Eastern Europe at that time. This is the end of the 19th century again, and beyond the xenophobia and anti-Semitism also that was spreading then. However, Argentina is only the largest, but not exclusively the only place where Latin American Jews live. In second is Brazil. Brazil has, if Argentina has probably 280 to 300,000, Brazil has 160 to 180,000. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Porto Alegre, the whole region of Rio Grande do Sul, also part of the Ashkenazi immigration that came in the 19th century, also connected with the Pampas and with this pioneer vision of where the Jews could find themselves anew. And after that is my home country, Mexico, that has between 30 and 40,000 Jews, I should say at this point. No national census in Latin America, just as in the United States, establishes how many people of Jewish descent are, because the question of religion is not asked in that census. So a lot of this is done by scholars in Israel or in the United States, and it can be always dependent on who responds and how those responses take place. And after Mexico, there is Colombia and Peru and Chile and Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico in smaller numbers, sometimes 2,000 Jews or 5,000 Jews, etc. Just for purposes of giving you a broader vision, the majority of rabbis are trained and ordained in Buenos Aires, from where they go to Mexico City, or they go to Havana, or they go to Santiago de Chile, etc. That is the magnet that resulted in an infrastructure in terms of religious and educational and business and other elements that allowed for the Argentine community to become the leading one. I also need to mention, for purposes of this discussion, and I hope that you will forgive me by offering this kind of snippets, notes, as I put it in the title, that will give you a rough sense of what the anti-Semitism, the Jewish life in Latin America is about, because it is so rich and so complex and so full of little venues that I am hoping that the book will do that, what I'm not going to be able to do that today. The other element that is very important to remember is that in Latin America, there have been at least 3, if not 4, Jewish immigrant waves. The very first wave probably should not be considered a wave, and it is the one of crypto-Jews or conversos or new Christians, marranos, anusim, depending on how one refers to them, all terms used to describe those that the Inquisition had persuaded or had themselves chosen to convert to Christianity, some of them in an authentic and overt and categorical way, and they became new Christians. The questions of purity of blood, pureza de sangre, who was and who wasn't a real Christian, how far back could you trace your ancestry, was always crucial during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance up until the expulsion in 1492. The tension between having come from a family of judíos viejos, old Christians, and then the ones that were new Christians, the ones that had recently converted. Keep in mind also that this population, often the ones that converted, as it always happens, could end up being more anti-Semitic than the anti-Semites themselves that were born out of other Christianity and other types of religious persuasions, because as we all know, a convert ultimately can feel that need to show that they are more integral than the integral people of that particular group. And it is no coincidence that the harshest, most violent and vicious of inquisitors were often new Christians, cristianos nuevos, who were going against, at times, even members of their own families, to show to the other members of the family how authentic they were, including the most famous one, Torquemada. Should this be considered a Jewish immigration when they arrived to Latin America without expressively describing themselves as Jews, hiding, keeping their traditions in secret at home, on Shabbat, on the high holidays, and figuring out, those that did want to figure out how to keep their tradition passing on from one generation to the next without alerting the attention of the neighbors and of the authorities and of the community at large? Should we try to name them as Jews when many of them did not recognize themselves as Jews per se, but for a variety of reasons, depending on the individual, were more or less assimilated or acculturated or integrated to the Catholic or Christian infrastructure of that society? I am of the conviction that at the very least an acknowledgement of who they are and where they come from is crucial, and thus, if not describing it as an immigration wave, at the very least recognizing that these individuals, with 1492 being the annus mirabilis, the wonder year in Hispanic culture, the year in which the Jews were expelled from Spain, the year in which Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered a new land, Columbus himself, in lore, often being described as a descendant of Jews who was looking for a new escape or for a new promised land, none of which has been proven, none of which necessarily needs to be pushed aside, because in history, rumor is often as important as facts. And also the year in 1492, when Spain became a nation through what we call la reconquista, the reconquest, by eventually bringing the South connected with the North, and the Catholic king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabel, establishing that it was going to be a nation under a single religion. There were many inquisitions in Europe, in Italy, in France, in England, but none likely as noxious and destructive as the Spanish one, and probably that is the reason why it is so broadly and infamously known as well. It is also important to think that if this is or isn't an immigration, what comes next doesn't happen for about 300 years. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, I have already described the Ashkenazi Jews, that Yiddish speakers that were coming from Shtetl and from ghettos, but contemporaneous or simultaneous with it, there was another immigration, the crumbling Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, that was falling apart, were Latino. Many of them had connections with Sfarad, with Spain, and were many Ladino-speaking communities in the 19th century had switched from Ladino into French as a language of education. Many of those also arrived to Latin America concurrently with the Ashkenazi Jews. And I am myself a third generation witness, so to speak, of in the very same neighborhood in downtown Mexico City, cerca de la Merced, for those of you who know Mexico, and not far from the Alameda Central, a big park that Diego Rivera painted, Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, Yiddish speakers and Ladino speakers would see and live together for the very first time, practicing in separate synagogues with different rituals, eating different food, but finally living in the same streets. History had pushed them in different directions, going into the Balkans, the Mediterranean, going to Eastern Europe, and eventually bringing them together in different parts of Latin America. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Not all Latin American Jews are Ashkenazi Jews, though probably like in the United States, there's a recent study that about 1 out of every 10 American Jews is of Sephardic background. Probably in Latin America, probably there's no such study done. 2 out of every 10 are of Sephardic, maybe even 3. The third large immigration that takes place is of, and it's not that large, it's of survivors of the Holocaust that come, and refugees. 1939 begins, 1942, 1943. It's a fascinating period in Latin America. There are countries when the United States is closing its doors to Jews that are in desperate need to find a new place. Places like the Dominican Republic are opening up, sometimes with the help of American Jewish dollars, in order to provide little spaces where those Jews can thrive or can have a new life for themselves. We could go in that direction if we need. And then again, I was suggesting that there might be another one in the 1960s and 70s, and probably much more in the last 20 to 30 years. There has been a solid Israeli immigration to Latin America. In business, young people who come to Latin America after the army to get lost or get wasted or to forget. And there are a lot of mixed marriages of Israelis and Jews, Israeli Jews and Jews in different parts of Latin America, in Peru, in Argentina, in Mexico. So that roughly gives you a sense of origins. I want to talk now of the 3 major markers of Hispanic antisemitism in the Hispanic world. I have already talked about 1492. Spain holds a very important role in the conception of how Jews are perceived in Latin America because of the role that Jews had in the period called La Convivencia, the coexistence, the period in which the 3 Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Catholicism, Christianity, made them coincide roughly for 3-4 centuries in Spain up until that moment of interruption in 1492. There are all kinds in the book that I am writing, there are all kinds of moments of how that supposedly but never truly harmonious relationship between those three Abrahamic faiths or religions ultimately exploded, and there was an internal war between them, and Jews are thrown out in 1492, and at the beginning of the 16th century, so are the people of Islamic faith. I think most of you know that Spain, after almost 500 years of having something that we called anti-Semitism without Jews, that is, the use of the Jewish image to create a satanic or a devilish force to find fault in anything that happens with modernity, even though there are very few Jews living in Spain, the Jews are still, during the Franco years, as late as the Franco years, being blamed for economic debacles, for leading people astray, for a cabal that is taking over the media, so on and so forth. In 1992, 500 years after the expulsion, and especially at the end of the 20th century, Spain apologizes to those Jews that have been expelled and invites them to come, to their descendants to come back. And it's a crucial moment in the history of Latin America and of the history of Jews. How many apply? According to recent numbers, it's between 80 and 90,000. How many are given passports? It's probably between 20 and 25,000. How many actually move to Spain? It's a very small fraction. And if we put the whole thing in perspective, Spain is going through a very deep economic crisis when this invitation of Jews to Jews is taking place. And the idea is that Jews, again, are going to come and solve the problems of Spain by engineering an economic revival. We've heard this before. We keep on hearing it all the time. Never, however, has Spain really invited or given passports to Muslims. Never. Probably for the same reason that Trump wants Canada to be a state, but has never invited Mexico to be a state. You choose who you're going to bring back, and you don't even mention the other. What happens one way or another is that not only the Jews look for ways to escape the mighty fist of the Inquisition and go to Latin America, thinking that that is a place where they are going to, some new Christians, some conversos, be able to practice their religion in a much more open and engaging way. But also the Inquisition travels to Latin America, and the two biggest centers are in Mexico and in Peru. There are not as many autos de fe, the public burnings, in Latin America as there are in Spain, but there are a number of crucial ones. And the two main stages for those autos de fe are, again, Mexico City and Peru, Lima, Peru. If some of you have seen the murals of Diego Rivera often includes autos de fe and San Benitos. Those are the dresses that look like the Ku Klux Klan, that some of the Jews that were identified as Jews needed to wear, the equivalent of the yellow star that the Nazis would mandate of the Jewish population. And I will say quickly that Diego Rivera thought that he was a descendant of conversos, just as his long-suffering wife, Frida Kahlo, was convinced that her father was a German Jew. I don't know that much about the truth in connection with Diego Rivera because we don't have DNA, but Frida Kahlo's father was not Jewish. Again, rumors in history are sometimes much more important than the actual facts in history. This is a moment that defines Latin American anti-Semitism because there is in the culture a culture of suspicion of who is and who isn't authentic, who passes for an insider and who passes for an outsider. And that is one of the reasons why I make the case that Hispanic anti-Semitism has to be deeply rooted in that concept of duality, of a pretending to be of old blood when in fact you might be of new blood. Very quickly, and because let me tell you, the book is made of 12 stories, and I'm keeping track, Magda, on this. 12 stories of 12 different individuals in crucial moments. And one of them is a very important story of a man in Mexico, Luis de Carvajal, the younger, who is a Christian and discovers that he is actually a converso and becomes convinced that he's a biblical prophet and tries to persuade other conversos to convert back to Judaism. He is the author of the very first Jewish autobiography that we have in the Americas about his whole process of conversion. And he is also the victim in 1595 of the biggest auto de fe to take place in downtown Mexico City. He lived for a long time in Monterrey, in the northern part of the city, of the country. In the history of Hispanic anti-Semitism, there are two major 20th century events. The first one happens in 1919 in Argentina. It's called La Semana Trágica, the Tragic Week. And it is the first and only pogrom that we have had in Latin America. It is a labor-related anti-Jewish outburst where hundreds of Jewish businesses are destroyed in Buenos Aires, in La Plata, and a number of Jews are killed. And it is the moment when Jews are immigrating, for the most part, from Eastern Europe, and they are seen, just as it's happening in the United States, as taking people's jobs, as taking people's beds in hospitals, and other such imaginary usurpations. And the second largest moment concludes the 20th century with the 1994 terrorist attack to the AMIA, the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. Iran orchestrated. This is a car bomb that explodes very early in July morning in Buenos Aires to the JCC in Buenos Aires, where the archives of the Jewish community have been stored, where the YIVO documents have been kept. And of course, the deaths are enormous. And for some scholars, the destruction of those archives are also immensely troubling. To this day, nobody has been brought to justice. At that time, Carlos Saul Menem, a Lebanese descent president, was in power, and the waters have been muddled time and time again. We don't have any accountability for what happened at that time. Very quickly, I want to conclude with two things. There's much to say about Hispanic anti-Semitism during the dirty war, La Guerra Sucia, of the military junta in Argentina, in Chile, in Paraguay, Uruguay. Roughly in Argentina, the number of victims in total were about 30 to 35,000. About 10% of that number were Jews, whereas Jews make about 1% of the total population of Argentina. They were targeted because they were Jews. And we have documents like Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, by a famous journalist called Jacobo Timmerman, where he is being interrogated by the guards in a prison, and he's being told that the Nazis didn't complete their job and that now the Argentines are going to complete that job. And finally, I want to tell you that there is both happy news and sad news. The president of Mexico is Jewish. She actually was a neighbor of mine. She's about a year younger in this. We grew up in the same neighborhood, about 3 or 4 blocks away. Claudia Sheinbaum. She is a perfect example of what have been telling you. There is the Sephardic side from Bulgaria, from in Claudia, and the Ashkenazi side, Yiddish speakers from, I believe it's Belarus or Ukraine, socialists, communists, and though she grew up celebrating the high holidays and Shabbat, she has distanced herself from the Jewish community, and the Jewish community has distanced itself from her as well. She is uncomfortable with being Jewish, though not uncomfortable with recognizing that she grew up as a Jew, if you can sort those out. And during the presidential campaign, she did something that some of us were shocked, but Frida Kahlo had already done it. She wore a crucifix in order to appeal to the larger Mexican population. And when asked why, if she was Jewish, she wore such a religious icon, she said, and maybe she's right, that the crucifix has lost its religious connotation and that now it's a pop culture item. And that didn't mean that she was now Christian or Catholic, subject to big debate. I find it extraordinary that Claudia Sheinbaum is one of the only 3 Jewish presidents or prime ministers in the world right now. Zelensky, Netanyahu, the only woman, Claudia Sheinbaum. She navigates a very challenging landscape in that she is pro-Palestinian, against the Israeli Gaza invasion, but tries not to speak out publicly about all this. And yet, most recently, after the atrocious groping that she went through, I'm sure you read about it, there was a protest orchestrated supposedly by Generation Z in Mexico to complain about the economic debacle that the country it was going through. And one thing that the US media was not reporting that is that there were many anti-Semitic elements in that protest saying, Judía, vete a la casa, Judía, no eres bienvenida, Jew, go home. He was born in Mexico. Judía, no eres bienvenida, you're not welcome. So enormous progress. There is a president for the first time in Latin America that at least comes from a Jewish background. That president herself sometimes might be taking some positions that one could connect with anti-Semitic regimes in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, from the left or the extreme left. She tries to navigate them in a quiet and non-belligerent way. And on the other hand, she is seen, not during the campaign, but increasingly so, as a president that comes from a minority that is dangerous. Let me conclude by saying that all these remarks come at a time, all these remarks that I've been mentioning, at a time of increased anti-Semitism, not only in the United States, but in the world at large. And Latin America has seen that expansion of anti-Semitism, particularly in nations that are led by left-wing presidents, such as Ecuador, in Nicaragua, until recently Chile, and so on. The left in Latin America since the 70s has been intricately connected with the Palestinian cause. And so I think one, in retrospect, could talk, and this is my last statement, of three moments. A moment of Hispanic antisemitism where there is a deeply religious element. It is the church describing the Jews as illegitimate, and the church that describes them as Christ killers and as promoters of a seditious heretical religion. The second stage happens in the 20th century, and that is Jews seen as factors of an usurpation of economic control. When I was growing up in Mexico, I was born in 1961, you could, as you still can, go to the corner in newsstand and buy a cheap copy of the Protocols of the Wives of Zion or Henry Ford's The International Jew, easily available for almost no money, and comic strips that are anti-Semitic in nature, easily available everywhere. And from the Yom Kippur War, roughly, but mostly from 1982, the invasion in Lebanon to the present, it is a mix that we see today in the United States of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, with Israel as a major factor in between the two, that pushes the Latin American Jewish communities to see themselves as both extensions of Israel in trying to distance themselves from the Israeli government or the Israeli army. I should state, just as everywhere in the world, in Latin America, Latin American Jews have complex views of Israel and have conflicted views as well. So there might be some that are in favor and others that are. And not unless and until we put all these three together, and not unless and until we see the complexity of the environment, will we fully understand what Hispanic anti-Semitism means. The forces of history, the reaction from the community, and how that a combustive connection mutates over time. Thank you.
Discussion, but before I hand it over there, I want to clarify a couple of things. This is the living together of the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi Jews is not the first time in Latin America.
Mhm.
Venice, Tzfat in early modern period, even Istanbul or Constantinople. There are many places where they lived side by side. So it's not the first time, and yes, like in Latin America, they so I felt that I needed to make clarify.
Well, in the late 19th century, was a major settlement area of Ottoman Jews.
Yeah, but I was like even early on, right? In the early modern period, the first time it's really Venice and the other places. Anyway, I open the floor for questions. I have a few of my own, but I don't want to dominate, and people online can submit them on the Q&A.
I was just wondering if, in terms of your study and overview, if there was anything about the capture of Eichmann in Latin America and like how that was received by.
That the capture of Eichmann in Latin America at the beginning of the 60s is an extraordinary moment for world Jewry, for Israel, and for the Jews of Latin America. As many of you will know, Eichmann, Ricardo Clement, he had changed his name, had escaped through all kinds of the rat route, as it's called, and made it anonymously to Argentina, where he worked in a car, in the car industry. And he had already been spotted by the Stasi, the Germans, and by the Mossad and eventually he was captured and flown to Israel, and where he was put on trial and eventually found guilty and paid with his life. It is a major moment in Latin American history for a number of different reasons, and I will only go to just the more salient ones. Many in Latin America, but particularly in Argentina, felt that this was an act of aggression against the sovereignty of an independent nation, Argentina, and that this new emerging country, Israel, that had been created in 48, now felt it could go and take a citizen of that country, no matter who that was, and fly it back without an extradition process and all the diplomatic, bureaucratic strategies. But it is very significant because immediately after the kidnapping and taking him to Israel, there was an outburst of anti-Semitism against the Argentine Jewish community sponsored by the German immigrants that were in close touch with native ultra-right groups that wanted to show their displeasure because Clement/Eichmann was very close to those extreme right groups when he was working. And this resulted in a quagmire for Argentine Jews, where they felt that they couldn't defend themselves and the government would not defend them. The government was angry at Israel and quietly supporting the violence and attacks. So for the very first time in the history of Latin America, there was the formation of a paramilitary group called Bitachon, which in Hebrew means security, that was members of the Jewish community, young, that were trained in order to defend that community. It had a copycat effect in Chile, in Uruguay, in Mexico, where I was a member.
So back to our order. So we have the man in the back, and then you, and then.
Here's that the president of Brazil is in the process of converting to Judaism. He's also rather friendly with President Trump. That's your template.
You mean the president of Argentina?
Argentina.
Of Argentina. Yeah, sympathizers of the Jewish community have been many. The Argentine Jewish community feels itself kind of distant from Milei in Argentina, and the closeness with Trump is itself complicated. I am mainly talking of the ones that are born Jewish from the beginning. I like Claudia Sheinbaum. There have been other presidents in Latin America that only after their presidency, including in Colombia, historians have found that they come from converso and new Christian families. So it might be that Claudia Sheinbaum is not the only first Jewish president. And maybe, who knows, she might not be the first woman president, but I'm not going to enter that complicated issue here. Milei is a Jew lover. And again, he's not the first one. Pinochet used to sometimes go to Shabbat services, and so did Fidel Castro.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the future of Jews in Latin America? That you're talking now about, possible anti-Semitism, pro-Palestinian. What is their future now?
I'll tie it in because there's a question from our colleague Marilyn Miller, also Latin Americanist and our past fellow. What are your thoughts on anti-Semitism education in Latin America today? Is it happening only in Jewish spaces, or is it part of the public discourse? How do Latin American Jews view the U.S. government intervention regarding what constitutes anti-Semitism on first.
That's a very,
Ties in the future and
very important question. Jewish education in Latin America and education for non-Jewish, for non-Jews, and more concretely, education that has to do with anti-Semitism in Latin America for the larger population is very limited in its reach and it doesn't have the funding or the support from the various governments. There have been initiatives that come mainly from the United States or in connection between the United States and Israel to create special editions of Anne Frank, different forms of courses that people can take online that are always initiated, but to the best of my knowledge, and I follow this, and sometimes I've served as a consultant, the reach is rather limited. And this, in part, explains or is connected with the fact that because of the small number of Jews in Latin America, really 1% of the population or less, very many people never cross paths with a Jew. And there is no popular culture about Jews the way there's popular culture in the United States about Jews, in movies, in television shows, etc. So the Jewish presence might be more a figment of people's imagination than the fact itself, depending again on the governments, depending on the juncture, what is happening in the Middle East, the allegiances of certain communities and the allegiances of certain educational organizations that you might have more or less, but it has not entered public schools. It has not entered at different levels, college. It's very hard to get education, even a course on Jewish history in public universities. Private universities, particular Jesuit universities, have much more than others. What is the future of the Jews in Latin America? What is the future of the Jews? Latin America is both an extraordinary place, and after spending years and years of studying it, a very mysterious place for me. I always thought that by now, the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, many Jews of Latin America would have left, but instead, many are coming back and are making their lives outside of cities. I am confident that in 100 years or 200 years, we'll continue to see Jews in Latin America. Exactly how? I don't think the numbers are going to be much bigger. There is both a benefit and a danger of being so small. A benefit because you can pass incognito, and danger is because you can pass incognito, and you can be the target of all kinds of animosities. But compared to other parts of the world, like Poland or the Arab world, Latin America seems to me to be much more benign and welcoming.
Yeah, a question that might be, hold on, I have to adjust my hearing aids so I don't hear my voice.
Just a little louder.
Okay. A question that might be arcane and might be relevant. In Argentina, and specifically in Buenos Aires, also in Paraguay and Uruguay, I wonder to what degree late 19th and early 20th century outsized participation of Jews in prostitution, running of bordellos, entrapment of Jewish girls from Galicia and mass. Does that still resonate in anti-Semitism and popular stereotyping, etc.?
Yeah.
And also, how do Jews retell their own story that way?
The question is, for those of you who don't know this story, a fascinating and problematic one. There was a trade of young, naive, Yiddish-speaking young women from the Pale of Settlement, brought mainly to Argentina, where they were promised that they would find marriage and a positive future, and they were brought into prostitution. That trade or that ring is known popularly as Tzvi Migdal. It is a name connected with one of the leaders, of the ringleaders, and there were hundreds of Jewish prostitutes and brothels in Buenos Aires and in La Plata. And in the 1920s and 30s, it was often seen as one of the activities that Jews engaged in: prostitution and mafia. Just as the Jewish mafiosi in the United States were also prominent at a particular time, this in Latin America is a significant period. There is in Buenos Aires and La Plata a cemetery, each of this, exclusive for those prostitutes that could not be allowed to be buried in the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in general. And I have visited those cemeteries. They are abandoned. The Jewish community doesn't want to talk about them, doesn't want to keep them. The families themselves are not yet ready to explore the past of some of their ancestors. I think my answer is going in that direction. There are 2 or 3 movies, documentaries that have dealt with that, with the history of the Tzvi Migdal, and there are also a couple of novels about the Tzvi Migdal. But given the size of the ring and its relevance, Sholem Aleichem has a story about it. Bashevi Zinger has another story about it. You would think that this would play an important role in how Argentine Jews shape their cultural consciousness and their history, but there's very, very little about it.